Discussion. Audience. This is addressed to Andreas Huyssen. Until the very last comments you made, it seemed that your recuperation of nationhood was not about political, electoral expediency, but about trying to be in step with what is happening in terms of national cultural politics in a unified Germany. My concern is that German national culture in the 20th century is not just any European national culture, just as American national culture, understood, racially speaking, in its dominant hegemonic sense, is not just any European-derived national culture. Those of us who belong to peoples that have been trampled over by either one or the other or both thus have serious doubts about the option you're posing. I understand that the left in Germany has historically had serious problems in terms of establishing a social base, but I don't quite see how what you're posing is a real alternative, particularly given the dangers involved. Huyssen. I share those kinds of concerns. At the same time, and I'm not very far at this point in my thinking about the question of nationhood and national identity in Germany, I have tried to critique a certain taboo on the left, and to show the necessity of opening up a debate on the question. No more, no less. I think this is as far as I would go. I could argue that there should be, and that there will be, a different kind of German national identity than the one that has been dominant in the past, and I emphasized at the beginning of the paper that if there were a productive discussion of national identity in Germany, then the recent history of Germany, that's why I started by focusing on the various anniversaries, will have to remain strongly inscribed within it. Where such a discussion would lead in terms of electoral politics, I have no way to predict. One may very well argue that it might not lead very far. The issue, however, has to be addressed. Evasion will only strengthen conservative definitions of nation. I also agree with you when you say that German national culture is not like any other, but one might of course ask whether there is any one that is like any other. I don't mean that as a facile response. It just seems to me that the question of national identity has been put on the table in a new way by the raw facts of the political events since 1989, that it has to be addressed publicly by the left, and that the discursive terrain should not be left only to the conservatives and, potentially, to a new far right. Bhabha. I just wonder a bit about your discussion of the negotiating of this sign of nationhood now, the process of opening up a discursive terrain. The rest of your talk was so focused on the double nature of nation and its internal boundary. But at the end, in the current Germany you describe, how do you provide a space, even within the left, from which those different discourses and their genealogies could be represented in a dialogue where negotiating power would be shared? That is the major problem, I think. The Turks, the East Germans. What would the representative bodies be? Huyssen. I admit my paper is very speculative on that level and somewhat distant from what is happening at this point in Germany, but I think that what would have to happen, concretely, is that there would have to be a discussion of a problem that the left has simply avoided. There would have to be a discussion of what actually constitutes German citizenship. German citizenship is still decided by blood lineage. It's based on a pre-World War I law. Now, if citizenship were to be determined automatically by place of birth, which would solve a major problem for many of the second and third generation Turks, for instance, who live in Germany and have lived in Germany for a long time, then the Habermasian claim, the attempt to hook Germany up with Western liberal culture, would perhaps be more persuasive. But instead of discussing this, the left has focused on political asylum, where Germany, because of its history of forced exile, has very liberal legislation. Citizenship would thus be a concrete space for discussion that should be opened up. However, I'm very pessimistic about the current political situation, where these spaces do not seem to be expanding, but actually seem to be shrinking. Audience. My question is directed toward the first two speakers. You both used a spatial metaphor, one of interval and the other of a space of indeterminacy, a gap, literally, between two words. And I wanted to know how such indeterminacy could be a useful agent in discussing identity. Bhabha. In fact, the main frame of what I was talking about was atemporality, belatedness, a way of questioning acts of naming carried out according to Enlightenment and modernist notions of progress. I think it's important to think about temporality instead as the possibility of reconstructing other kinds of histories, ones that do not require, as I said in my comments, a kind of sovereignty of desire. And so, really, as far as I'm concerned, I wish to take to task the growing spatialization operating in postmodern critical metaphors, metaphors which lead to saying unthinkingly, New York is a new Calcutta. You know, we are now also living in the third world. We're all migrants. We're all diasporates. My argument, in the longer study of which this is a part, race, time, and counter-modernity, operates against that kind of thing. So I think my specific point is really about how belatedness functions to critique certain priorities and myths about culture and modernization. Jacques Rancière. In answer to your question, I would say that it is really just the opposite. The social construction of an identity must be conceived in terms of a logic of the subject, that is, in terms of the logic of an actor who cannot be identified with any sociological category or constituent group, who always bears the name of the other and incorporates an impossible identification. This is not just an abstract idea. For me, it is grounded in my research on French workers' history. There it became obvious that one couldn't simply apply social types and categories to this movement, because in doing so, one dismissed the inner division that was at the very heart of the assumption of the label worker or proletarian, both in discourse and in practice. These subjects both assumed and did not assume the label worker. Against those who treated them as workers, their workers, they took on this label. So that they did not identify the name worker or proletarian with a definite technical and social activity, but with a certain way of being at one and the same time inside and outside the symbolic order of the distribution of social identities. What I wanted to question by means of this example is the deceptive appearance of self-evidence of a social movement as the expression of a social group. A social movement is not the movement of a sociological group. It is a movement of subjects, of people who try to find or apprehend an identity as fighters through the very dismissal of their sociological identity, the identity given to them by a social order. Audience. When Andreas spoke of the libidinal investment in nationhood, he seemed to suggest that we should shy away from those kinds of identifications. But that raises a problem, as I think Cornel said, of how the politics of desire can operate in a world when libidinal politics tends to fragment identities, draw upon racist identifications, years of miscegenation. If you look at the everyday world and the way desire is constructed, it's based on the politics of domination, the politics of oppression. So at the same time as we raise this question, for example, in Germany, how can we think about drawing upon libidinal investment in nationhood in a constructive way? Is there a way to imagine a non-racist, non-repressive libidinal investment? Huyssen. That is the question I'm posing with the paper. Do we have to identify the politics of desire with racism and oppression? I have not, as I suggested, found an answer for this, but I'm convinced that the question has to be asked in order to create alternatives. If it does not get asked, then that kind of political terrain is left to those who are occupying it so successfully now. Ernesto Laclau. What keeps some room for hope in the question of German nationalism is perhaps that today the ideological changes are taking place in an overdetermined context. That is to say that German national identity is being asserted in a context very different from that of the emerging European nationalism of the 19th century. The fact that present-day national identities are being asserted in the context of the construction of the European community gives to progressive forces room to maneuver. I agree with you that negating the reality of a strong German identity is nonsensical. Someone like Habermas was, I think, much happier in the Federal Republic when he was part of a westernized European identity. Today he must live with the brute fact of German nationalism, and he is clearly uncomfortable. But I think that the assertion of a German identity can take place in a variety of ways, not all of them producing reactionary effects. The overdetermination of the contexts within which this identity is asserted is what counts, and, as I said earlier, the context of the European community put some important limits on the development of a purely xenophobic politics. Huyssen. Ernesto's comment is very pertinent here. European unification contains and alters the ways in which national identities in Europe will be constructed in the future. The relationship between nation and nation-state is already no longer what it used to be, but let us not fool ourselves. Even if the sovereign nation-state disappears, it will only have been displaced by a larger unit, Europe, that may very well act like a traditional nation-state toward other parts of the world. And internally, I don't think for 1 minute that older national identities will simply disappear with European unification. The widely divergent reactions to the Gulf War in England, Germany, France, even Czechoslovakia, showed how national history still determined the thoughts and actions in different parts of Europe. Audience. My question is related to post-colonialism and the origins of self, origins of the other, things that Bhabha addressed. In the process of enacting equality, do you have the right, the social right, to imagine, vocalize, and author a sense of I, whether collectively or individually, that would exist in isolation from your history of racism and colonialization? Because it seems to me this issue of post-colonialism doesn't deal with the whole problem of a homogenous post-colonial world. I just wanted to know if you could elaborate. Bhabha. It would be precisely the response of a once colonizing world now to see a homogenized post-colonial world. That is why it's very important to mark various different sites of the I's enunciation, as I attempted to do today. You can turn to Derek Walcott or Toni Morrison or Sonia Sanchez and see how the question of race and history and identification was being negotiated at each one of those sites. So the very idea of a homogenous post-colonial response would feed yet again into a kind of polarization. If we think of the Gulf War, we could address the example of what appeared from a certain distance to be a coordinated, homogenous response on the part of the, I'll use the word, Third World. There was opposition to the Gulf War from India, from Pakistan, and from most African countries. Yet, as opposed to this, what was interesting in each one of those responses was the way in which the Gulf War was being used by groups of peace protesters in each country to oppose their own dominant and, in many cases, undemocratic regimes. So the Gulf issue was being used in very differently negotiated ways. Further, I think one of the most interesting non-homogenizing effects in many third world countries was the surfacing of a desire actually to identify with loss. The identification was not with Saddam Hussein, with his kind of political regime, but with other sorts of things, with death, with despair, with desires to modernize, which would, in some senses, be to destroy. So there are a number of ways in which that opposition to US policy might be seen to be invariant, but it is not. That's the really important issue. It's too easy to homogenize that response.